In this lecture, we will talk about seed plants and one of the two major groups of seed plants, the gymnosperms. So we will start by talking about seeds, which are a new trait that were not present in the ferns or the lycophytes. With the advent of seeds, female gametophytes are no longer free-living as they were in the ferns. Instead, they are attached to the sporophyte. Additionally, male gametophytes now are not photosynthetic and free-living. They do move around, but they only do so inside a pollen grain. We'll talk a little bit more about what those mean, and then we will talk about characteristics of gymnosperms, which are the group of seed plants that have cones and that have naked seeds, so seeds that are exposed to the outside environment. Gymnosperms make two kinds of cones. They make pollen cones and they make ovule cones. They also are capable of lateral growth. So if you remember back to the stem lecture, they have a vascular cambium and they are able to make new xylem, and hence they can make true wood. We'll talk about three groups of cycads. We will focus, three groups of gymnosperms. We'll talk about the cycads, the ginkgos, and the conifers. This is a diagram or a sketch we've looked at before of the different major groups of terrestrial plants. Recall that the charophytes are not actually plants, they're algae, but that they are the group that gave rise to all of the terrestrial plants. Then in the terrestrial plants, we have three groups that are all lumped together as bryophytes, and what these have in common is that they have a haploid dominant generation, so the gametophyte generation is dominant, and the sporophyte is always small. We then had the lycopods or lycophytes, as well as the ferns, and we said in both of these groups there were free-living gametophytes that were small and free-living sporophytes that were large. We are now up to the seed plants with the gymnosperms, and after this we will move on to the angiosperms. When we look at these groups on the phylogeny, remember this shows the relationships among species, and anything connected closer to the top of the diagram is more closely related. So on this diagram we can see that the connection closest to the top right here is between the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. That means they are more closely related to each other than they are to anything else. And you can see too that the gymnosperms and angiosperms are put in this box because these are the two groups that comprise the seed plants. So what I want to do on this diagram is talk about the role of the sporophyte and gametophyte generation in the various groups of plants that we've talked about throughout the semester. We are going to see that seed plants complete the transition from having a sporophyte that is completely dependent on the gametophyte to the reverse. We are now going to have a gametophyte that is dependent on the sporophyte. So that's a major change, and I want to make sure that it's clear. So let's start with the first group to diverge on this phylogeny, the one that diverged furthest back in time right here, and that is the charophytes. So the charophytes don't have a sporophyte generation at all. Remember, all of the multicellular charophytes are diploid, they are haploid, and so they are gametophytes. There is no sporophyte present in the charophytes. And these were the algae, but you can see here that they gave rise to a lineage that then diverged and gave rise to three lineages, here, here, and here. And these three lineages became the liverworts, the mosses, and the hornworts. And in all three of these groups, they're united by the fact that the gametophyte is the dominant generation. So the big plants that we would see are all haploid gametophytes. Sporophytes are now present, but they're always small and they always are nutritionally dependent on the gametophyte. So they're here, but they're not yet the important generation. Then we see that the lineage that divided from the hornworts continued on and gave rise to the lycophytes, and later to the ferns. These two groups are united by the fact that they have both a free-living gametophyte generation, so that's the haploid generation. They also have a free-living sporophyte generation. And unlike the bryophytes, in these two groups, the sporophyte is now the dominant generation. It is the one that is large and the one that we would encounter if we were walking around. There is a free-living gametophyte stage, however. It is small, but it is photosynthetic and able to get its own nutrition. It is not connected to the sporophyte. So in your fern dishes right now, you're probably seeing these really tiny little green circles. Those are the free-living gametophyte generation, and as we continue to watch those dishes over time, we should see sporophytes eventually grow out of them and start growing their own leaves. So what we've left with the ferns is independent free-living gametophytes and sporophytes. That now diverges into this lineage of seed plants, and in both of our kinds of seed plants, we are going to see that there's still a gametophyte generation, there's still a multicellular haploid, but it is now, at least for the females, attached to and nutritionally dependent on the sporophyte. So that's a complete change from where we started, where we had a dominant gametophyte and a small sporophyte attached to it. We now have a dominant sporophyte and a small gametophyte attached to it. Why is this important? Remember that gametophytes are haploid. So if gametophytes are haploid, that means that they have only one copy of each chromosome. And that's a problem if anything goes wrong, if the DNA gets damaged, because then those cells have no backup copy. So this is not the condition that we would prefer to be in. And indeed, humans and most other animals spend most of their time in a diploid state. So in sporophytes, remember, the individuals are diploid. That means in diploid cells, there are two copies of each chromosome in each cell. If one of the copies gets damaged, maybe this gene stops working, there's still another working copy. And that means these cells are going to be more likely to survive even if there's damage. We are now going to continue on and talk about the new structures that occur in seed plants. And the big new structure is the ovule, which occurs in female structure in seed plants. So the ovule contains female reproductive cells, and this did not occur in the ferns. It is new now in the seed plants. We're going to talk about the structure of the ovule over the next few slides. The ovule includes an outer protective layer called the integument. And you can see the integument is pictured here. So it's this outside. And this is going to be important because there's going to be nutrition inside that needs to be protected by things that want to eat it. There's also nutritive tissue. So everything inside here in green is our nutritive tissue. All of this. And somewhere in here, there's going to be a spore. So this life cycle actually has a lot in common with the life cycles that we've already talked about. Just like in the ferns or the lycophytes, there was a spore that germinated eventually into a gametophyte. That's still going to be true. The difference here is that this spore is now attached to the female plant inside this integument instead of growing off on its own on the ground somewhere. So here's our spore. We're going to follow it and see what happens. The spore in here is the female spore, and so it is going to divide by mitosis. when it divides by mitosis, it is going to form a multicellular female gametophyte. We can see that on our diagram over here. The spore used to be something small in the middle. It is now this large structure. And the female gametophyte, remember, is haploid. So by the process of mitosis, it can make haploid egg cells. And depending on the kind of plant, it might make one or more than one of these. On this diagram, it's made a couple of eggs. The egg eventually is going to get fertilized when a pollen grain, which you can see pictured up here, lands somewhere near the ovule and germinates. So this is the grain, and here's the tube where it germinated. This tube is going to come down towards the egg, and it's going to deliver a sperm. You can see the sperm right here. That sperm then is going to make its way to the egg and fertilize it. And once fertilized, the egg becomes a zygote. Remember, the zygote is now diploid, or 2N. That diploid zygote is then going to divide by mitosis and form an embryo. So the embryo is the immature diploid phase. That's pictured here. It is still inside that female gametophyte, pictured here, and there's probably still some leftover nutritive tissue, pictured here, and the whole thing is inside the seed coat. So this is sort of like a complex burrito. But the important thing is that the embryo's inside, it is developing in a safe environment with nutritional reserves, and it's going to have a better chance of surviving than an embryo might if it was just developing out on the ground. This integument, the outer layer that we were talking about earlier, is still going to serve its protective function, but now instead of calling it the integument, it is going to mature into the seed coat. And we are all familiar with seed coats. On many of the foods that we eat, this will be present. One example that we're all familiar with are popcorn grains. And so you know, if you try to bite down on a popcorn grain that hasn't popped, it's extremely hard and might damage your teeth. I don't recommend doing it. And even inside popped popcorn, we're always getting some food stuck in our teeth, and it's this yellow stuff. So this is just the seed coat. Once the popcorn pops, the seed coat breaks apart and gets stuck inside, and then because it's hard and protective, we have difficulty breaking it down, and so it gets stuck in our teeth. Inside of the seed coat, we still have our embryo and nutritional reserves, as we diagrammed on the last slide, and so you can see the nutritional reserves here. It's the part that we like to eat in the popcorn. So for a fern, it has to grow wherever it lands, and the sporophyte has to become independent immediately upon growing. It doesn't have any good source of nutrition. A seed is very different. First, it is able to disperse. So it is able to be carried away by an animal or wind or water and get far away from the maternal plant. So by getting far away from its mom, it is less likely to get mom's diseases, it is less likely to compete with mom, and it's not going to be in the shade of mom. So it might have a better chance of surviving. Additionally, seeds allow dormancy. This means that the seed can survive in an inactive state during difficult conditions. For example, a plant might have trouble surviving winter, but if it can make a seed, that seed can sit dormant during the winter and wait for warm weather. Similarly, in areas where it gets dry for a few months, that's a tough time for a plant to survive, but the seed can stay dormant and wait for wet weather before germinating, and then the sporophyte has a good chance of surviving. Additionally, I'll emphasize one more time that there's nutrition inside seeds. These food reserves are going to allow that young plant to start growing before it becomes dependent on photosynthesizing and acquiring its own nutrition. we're going to talk about the fact this is also important for us. So as we were saying, the nutrition in seeds is important not just for plants, it's also important for humans and other animals. That's because a lot of our food comes from seeds. Whenever we eat grains or corn, for example, we are eating seeds. So without this nutritional resource, humans would not be anywhere near as successful.